The way we've talked about the person-centered approach and how we conceptualize mental health, I think it implies there being this power struggle or this tension, I suppose, throughout therapy between a person's genuine feelings and the parts of themselves that are due to conditions of worth and that are kind of introjections and values taken on from elsewhere. And there's often a moment or an ongoing period where a person's really unclear, like, they're noticing different parts of themselves at war with each other, or contradictory feelings coming up, and it's really quite confusing which parts of themselves to listen to. And I think with traditional person-centered theory, the assumption is, as a person gets more in touch with themselves and they're really congruent and integrated and they're reaching level 6 or level 7 on the continuum, then they'll just have a certain clarity of thought and clarity of mind. I guess my assumption was, if you're fully aware of your organism and in touch with all of your experience, then those kind of contradictions will kind of resolve themselves. And I suppose that's still somewhat true, but configurations of self essentially though is the idea that even when you're fully in touch with all of your feelings, there still can be inconsistencies and there still are contradictions. And the idea actually is that the self isn't a fully consistent thing. A person's self, the genuine self, is made up of almost somewhat self-contained pockets and collections of characteristics and personality traits which may emerge at different times in a person's life. Rogers related to this at some point where I think he said something about congruence, like his congruence with a 5-year-old is different to his congruence with some 60-year-old maths professor or something like that. Different parts of him are naturally going to emerge in different contexts, and that kind of is what configurations of self relates to. This idea that our self is contextual and it's always in dialogue with our environment, being totally in touch with ourselves, if that's even possible. Like I said before, I think it's an ongoing process of trying to explore, but the idea is that who we are can genuinely change somewhat based on the environment and the context in which we find ourselves. If you're talking to a 5-year-old and you want to be congruent, you want to be genuine with this 5-year-old and have a real relationship with this 5-year-old, that is going to be expressed differently. Who you are is going to be expressed differently to with someone else. Certain maybe parts of yourselves, genuine parts of yourselves, emerge and become more visible, and they come to the surface, and others get put to one side. And I think most people can probably relate to this if they think of examples of them talking to people in different areas of their life, whether it's somebody, an old friend from their childhood, or a work colleague, or their boss, or their partner, or their children. You might be yourself with everyone. You might not feel like you're being false. You might really feel like you're being genuine with them, but different elements of yourself are going to come to the forefront. And that's kind of what configurations of self acknowledge. I first came across the concept in this book here, Person-Centered Therapy Today, New Frontiers in Theory and Practice by Dave Mearns and Brian Thorne. I found it quite refreshing when I read this book to have ideas that were building on what Rogers spoke about and what Rogers developed, that are building on. They're not just drawing from, they're actually developing it further, and people coming up with their own ideas. That's quite cool. It's quite a novel idea when I first came across it, to be honest, because so much of the theory is still based purely on Rogers. It's quite nice to see what other people think and what other people have done to develop it further. Their book and their work in general is really interesting, and they're really kind of forward thinking even now. I mean, this is 23 years old, this book, but even now it's still quite forward thinking in terms of you're pushing the theory further and developing it into new frontiers, basically. So their quote is, "The self is a composite of its various configurations coexisting in a creative and self-protective conflict." In other words, and I quite like this idea, is that the actual self isn't necessarily entirely self-contained and entirely consistent. It can be somewhat fragmentary. I imagine like bubbles being made up of little bubbles and pockets of different areas that can become more visible or less visible dependent on context. And sometimes when a person wants to navigate a certain issue or have certain feelings about things, they may well have contradictory feelings. They may well spot that they feel this way, but then there's a part of them over here that feels like this. And the idea of having configurations of self I like a lot, because it enables me, and it has enabled me with clients, to be able to observe these different parts of what the client's feeling, and just observe them without having to resolve them, or without having to even internally place some kind of value judgment on which of these is due to the organism and which of these is due to conditions of worth. I don't need to do that. I can stay in their process and simply acknowledge these contradictions and the confusion that they give rise to without needing on any level really to resolve them, because perhaps contradiction, once you crack open the consistent sense of self, or the different kind of portrayals that people have, maybe under the surface we are all just a big mess of contradictions. Maybe that's who we are, or at least or at least we are collections of consistencies, but we are made up of numerous different self-contained collections. That's what configurations of self, essentially, as far as I understand it, is all about. I suppose it's worth making clear that this is distinct from like a dissociative disorder, like dissociative identity disorder, where a person really takes on entirely separate identities without fully really being aware of those different identities. This is different because it's one person observing that they go into these different areas, and it's the awareness of those different pockets of consistencies, those different configurations, and being able to spot them and observe their inconsistencies and the tensions and confusion they give rise to. Configurations of self, though, for me at least, has really helped me hold contradictory feelings without feeling as though some feelings need to be valid and some don't. Like, people can legitimately hold two feelings that are contradictory, and yet both of those feelings may be valid. They may just be coming from different configurations. And I suppose previously that was a difficult thing for me to kind of get my head around. I kind of assumed that if someone holds two different feelings, surely only one of those feelings are real and the other feelings aren't real, and we need to figure out, or maybe we don't need to figure it out, but in my head that's how I was looking at it. And configurations of self for me, really enables me to hold on to those contradictions without assuming that some of the feelings must be invalid and only one set of feelings are real or valid. It's been really helpful in that respect.